June 25, 1839, Natchez, Mississippi. Evening heat pressed low over the river road as lanterns woke along the bluff and the Sabbath bells began their patient rehearsal across the fields. In the rear yard behind the big house, dusk pooled under the pecan's sparse shade where steam from the wash kettles thinned, and Martha, a laundress with wrists salted by lye, weighed a pewter thimble in her palm. The small, bright measure of work turned suddenly heavy as creed. The metal kept a residue of sun and answered her skin with a steady warmth that did not come from blood. Its rim, nicked by years of hems, felt like the edge of a word waiting to be spoken. Before we go on, please tell us where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. On the back gallery, white garments faced the yard in an unblinking row. Shirts, shifts, napkins, a quiet tribunal that lifted, held, and settled with each veer of wind. Their pallor was not enemy, she knew. The use made of whiteness had been. Names rose within her, Ruth first, then others gathered by labor and loss, and moved as inward liturgy, bead to bead, breath to breath. She did not speak them. The night would hear them when the hour narrowed and asked for truth without witnesses. From the service hall came the grammar of a house that believed itself eternal. A latch dropped with practiced certainty, a hinge cleared a copper throat, another hinge yielded a courteous sigh where Greece had taught it better manners. In the study beyond, a lamp drew a slim seam of amber through the shutter, stitching brightness across the lawn. Ledgers drowsed there in their pressed leather and would wake at a finger's touch to instruct the world in tidy harms. Whale oil breathed its faint sweetness under the reek of starch and wood smoke, and the bells, iron sure, stepped down the ridge like measured boots. She set the thimble beside an axe head, newly honed upon the gallery step, iron laid flat like a tongue refusing to boast. The hickory haft leaned near, a straight length of patience that remembered forests and winters and hands unlike her own. She touched the haft where grain ran honest, then pressed 2 fingers to the cool blade. Wood and iron stood as 2 halves of a sentence, waiting for the verb of an hour to join them. The thimble, faithful servant of hems, looked almost like a votive beside the steel, and together they taught her what tools become when law deserts the living. A breath came up from the river, mud-sweet, leaf-bitten, and made the drying lines stir. One cuff brushed her forearm with the lightest apology. In the dining room, someone struck a spoon against a rim and then remembered quiet. Elsewhere, a floorboard confessed a footstep and then repented. She lifted the haft, fitted the tenon to the eye with a twist, and felt the joined seat home. Not a clap. Only that small assent. Wood gives iron when they agree to share a duty. She let it rest again, assembled but undecided, like a witness sworn and waiting. The yard's shallow troughs kept the day's light as a faded sheen. Lye pricked the air clean and stern. Martha lifted the thimble, tilted it toward the failing glow, saw pewter take a thin crescent and surrender it at once. She remembered every finger it had guarded, the uncounted pricks it had warded off, the hems it had circled into tidiness under another woman's gaze. In her palm now it weighed beyond its size, as if metal could absorb a vow. Ruth, she said within, without mouth, and the name settled where the sternum learns to carry more than lungs. She turned her face toward the study's shuttered lamp and considered the heat a paper spine could bear before unlearning its pride. She let her gaze climb to the dressing room where garments on padded forms rehearsed posture for morning, and to the parlor ceiling where the chandelier owned more light than a human ought. Rooms tutored their keepers as much as their servants. Tonight she heard each lesson with the respect one gives an adversary. Bells answered themselves again, far, firm, and unembarrassed, and laid their octave across her shoulders like a yoke she chose. A kitchen door settled in its frame with a new discretion she had taught it by Greece. The sound pleased her more than it should. Crickets found their pitch, a dog turned twice, and believed in sleep. She slipped the thimble into her apron pocket, where cloth knows how to cradle small certainties, and she lifted the axe head until iron cooled her hand and steadied the small unrest beneath her breastbone. The haft stood ready. The line of whites held their breath. The study's lamp stitched and unstitched its ribbon on the grass. Natchez drew a first darkness over its roofs and lanes. River light thinned and found the margins. The bells paused between phrases, then spoke again as if to measure the lungs of the night. Martha looked once to the yard path, once to the hall's door, once to the fading western sky, and gathered stillness as if it were a tool. Before we go further into this night's accounting, tell from what place you keep watch, and at what hour this telling has reached you, that we may hear how far its echo has traveled. Night laid a thin crust of cool over Natchez, while heat still smoldered in the day's seams, and the riverfront shook itself awake under whale oil lamps. In town, tavern doors breathed out cinnamon and yeast. Fiddles frisked and slapped time against boot leather. White cloths unfurled across inn tables like tame daylight, promising plenty to those already full. The cobbles rang with a cheerful clatter, and a shop bell tattled each entrance as if commerce were a hymn with a bright refrain. Up on the ridge, the plantation lane kept a winter of spirit. Cabins hunched side by side, low roofs catching dew, doorboards swollen tight in their frames as though reluctant to admit another hour. Hinges rasped when persuaded, old metal voicing a tired truth. Then fell quiet as children were gathered back from the stoop. Ash-sour steam rose from kettles in the washing yard and lacquered the air with a bitter sheen that clung to hair and hand. The well rope, worn smooth by thirst and work, gave a low, fibrous groan each time the bucket turned, a sound deeper than complaint and older than comfort. In the big house dining room, porcelain blinked under steady flame, while the long table rehearsed authority in polished syllables. Silver, crystal, the straight grammar of knives aligned. The chandelier groomed its own radiance. It cast a fine net over wainscot and carpet, a glow that mistook control for mercy. A bell on the bluff counted the evening into the parlor's marrow with iron patience, its tone welcomed like a neighbor in rooms where hunger did not sit. In the washing yard, that same bell reached through steam and threadbare sleeves, not benediction but measure, an hour laid upon shoulders already carrying two. Martha moved between these climates without changing her name. The service hall exhaled oven heat and roasted herb, the soft boast of a kitchen that never starved. Then, with one step, yielded to the night's clean bite at the gallery rail. She learned each air by the skin, the buttery hush of long-handled spoons against china, the chalky breath of lime and lye, the tannin of river damp that slipped up the rise as a rumor of far water. A latch took instruction from her thumb and rose without argument. Elsewhere a lock stiffened, as if rehearsing refusal. Doors taught a lesson at every touch, where pride lived, where patience had been planted, where a hinge remembered kindness. Downhill, laughter broke like glass and reassembled itself as song. Uphill, talk braided low and close around stoops where light dared not stand. Names traveled in that quiet, not shouted, but born, each syllable a coal-cupped in hand. Ruth, Old Charity, the twins in the third cabin who kept fever at bay by sheer attention. No ledger owned such count. The memory lived in mouths and the small obligations people keep without witness. When someone sneezed in the next yard, 3 heads lifted, a ladle paused, a door eased wider, sound traveling like duty from palm to palm. She paused at the dining room threshold long enough to read the table's weather, the slight drift that gathered near the head, the sluggish corner where heat lay down and refused to move. Then turned back to the corridor where her work wore rougher cloth. She thought of the baptismal basin asleep beneath its linen in the rear gallery. Water planned for Sunday play-acting at grace. She thought of the preacher's voice, smooth as polished wood, rolling up the stair while the mantel clock picked seconds with a sparrow's beak. Bells from the bluff offered another phrase, and the two worlds received it differently. Downtown as accompaniment, up here as instruction. Between sanctioned glow and patient gloom ran the sandy lane, ruts shining with dew, like narrow mirrors set into earth. Martha's steps stitched the two, carrying heat to cold and cold back to heat, learning the house's tongue by its hinges and the yard's by its rope and bucket. In town, the shop bell tattled again. In the quarters, the bucket's throat answered with a low yes. She took both sounds into her keeping and walked on, a woman measuring the night, not by comfort, but by consequence. Natchez, Mississippi. June heat leaned into late afternoon, and the storeroom between kitchen and wash-house kept a penitent cool, its brick floor damp with old rinse and its shelves freckled by flour dust. The smell of lye and starch lived there like a stern ant, and in that narrow air Martha faced the mistress, who stood with a folded collar in one hand, as if virtue could be creased into linen. The preacher, hat tilted against the lintel, offered a nod that mimicked witness more than it bore it, his shoes finding the clean boards and refusing the damp. Martha named her price, perfect collars, spotless damask, a week's worth of white unblemished by gravy or cuff, and asked the one thing that trembled when spoken. Ruth to be kept from the dockside block. No seal warmed wax, no ledger marked a mercy. Only a smile, light as a moth, and that negligent nod took the place of ink. Market day walked up from the river on the breath of steamboats, and ledgers rode under arms like small kings seeking tribute. The road to the wharf carried heat in its ruts. Sun leaned off the water and pressed cheeks until eyes blurred. Martha did not step among the boxes and bales. She had been sent to kettles. Yet the hour made its way into the yard like smoke that refuses doors, and the tale arrived in pieces. Old Charity's grandson sent to hold a halter, the stable boy called to lead a team, the mistress's new gloves laid out as if for a christening. Someone who had taken saltfish to the docks came back with the smallest news carved on the face. Ruth stood with a strip of muslin tied above the wrist, the knot a pale command against brown skin. A bell from town counted the moment with a clean metal tongue, and each stroke seemed to find bone before it found air. The muslin was the color of napery, table color, sermon color, pressed into work it never confessed to. Martha pictured the square knot pinched by a man who did not know her sister's laugh, pictured the way Ruth would keep the jaw from trembling by biting where cheek and molar meet. No thunder closed the sky. A pen scratched. A figure changed columns. A white garment somewhere on a back gallery slept, believing itself pure. She set her hands back into suds and worked a cuff until the cloth squeaked under her fingers. The kettle breathed its alkali into her throat until she coughed and tasted copper. She did not ask where they sent Ruth. The answer, when it came weeks later with the cane's word on a boatman's breath, did not require the shape of place. Fever married Ruth and hurried the rites. In the corridor that linked the wash-house to the kitchen, doors gathered heat and exhaled it, and the walls kept a fine powder of starch like sifted snow at ankle height. There, a bright door-pin lay in soot. One hinge's small heart escaped its task, caught in the black like a stub of fallen star. Martha stopped. In that glittering speck of iron she saw the house's grammar falter, the joint where command met obedience and forgot its manners. She knelt, pin between finger and thumb, and it bit just enough to name itself. She let the sting stand. A vow cannot live without the blood it asks, and this was a beginner's drop. She set the pin on the window ledge where light found it and made it briefly ceremonial. The pewter thimble in her apron warmed to her skin as if it too listened. She had measured hems with it for years, cupping the small dome against needle push, counting stitches by habit until cloth bowed to line. Now the thimble answered a different measure. How much of a life a promise costs when it is spoken by a mouth that refuses the ledger. The preacher's nod returned in memory, notched thin as a dull coin, and she weighed it against Ruth's muslin knot. The scale broke, and with it the patience of hemming as a language sufficient to order the world. Evening came and put a thin shine on the scullery tiles. In the study, lamplight swam behind shutters, a pale river that did not wash anything clean. The bells along the bluff offered their slow phrases, tempered, practiced. Each stroke set itself within her ribs like a nail-set flush, not protruding, but present. She counted not the numbers, but the spaces between them, and learned where breath might turn from plea to sentence. In the mistress's dressing room, garments stood up like sleepwalkers behind closed doors, their white caught from sun and soap both. Martha imagined turning their fronts to the wall, making them look at plaster instead of mirror. She returned to the storeroom. The preacher's hat was gone. On the shelf, a ledger slept under a folded cloth to keep dust from its leather, a kindness never extended to backs like hers. She lifted the corner and saw neat lines and tidy sums, the alphabet of taking written with a moderate hand. The ink held its shine in a few places where last week's figures had not yet dulled. A scent like damp hay rose when she fanned the pages gently, a domestic perfume that pretended innocence. She set the cloth down again, not to protect the ledger, but to remind herself where tenderness is wasted and where it is owed. At the wash trough a shirt waited, armpits stiff with salt. She beat it on the plank with the flat of her palm in a rhythm just slower than the bell, an unchurchly hymn that kept the hands from shaking. The axe haft stood in the lean-to, married to its head. When she had set the tenon home, wood and iron had spoken to her in a voice she had not learned from any pulpit. Tools can refuse their appointed story, if taught. Doors can learn new vows from grease and patience. White cloth can be recruited by consequence instead of by pride. Ledgers can be made to inhale something other than the sum of breath. She folded the muslin strips destined for tomorrow's collars and placed them in a stack that would not tremble. The thimble's rim touched her thumb as she removed it, and the small ring left by the pressure looked for a breath like a wedding band, given by no one and promising nothing. She set the thimble on the sill beside the hinge pin and let the two metals know each other in the low light. One domestic, one structural, one soft with service, one hard with joinery. Between them, an idea stood up and found its shoes. By full dark, town lamps climbed their poles and stood their posts along the bluff, and the bells finished their rehearsal for a day that had not earned the name. Martha rinsed the last length of linen, wrung it until water left by obedience, and slung it over the line with a snap that sounded like a page turned after the telling is over. In her chest, Ruth's name ceased to burn and began to steady. She lifted the axe haft once as if to know its balance, felt the good pull of weight against palm, and set it back with care. Then she thumbed the latch that had remembered its lesson and let the door close itself without quarrel, the corridor's breath laying a cool hand along her jaw as she turned toward the night's stricter grammar. Night pressed its cool cheek against the smokehouse wall, and the lean-to beside it held a pocket of breath that smelled of resin, damp earth, and old iron. A lantern hooded to a thumb's-width slit sent a narrow seam of light across the bench where tools waited like patient elders. Martha set the pewter thimble down, its small dome kissing wood with a hush, and lifted the axe handle so the hickory could speak through her palm. The grain thrummed a muted accord, not sharp enough to be sound, steady enough to be believed. She drew the haft close and touched her ear to it, as if the wood had kept a memory the house had tried to forget. She did not test the blade on air. She turned it sideways and let the iron rest along the bench as a spine, edge hidden from the night. The purpose she asked was not cutting, but keeping. A door held, a path preserved, a breath-given room. The haft, once a handle for winter's labor, learned a new office, the kind of strength that favors endurance over show. She checked the join, pressed the tenon once more into the eye, and felt the small assent two materials give when patience has married them. On the bench lay a biscuit tin, rubbed clean where fingers had polished away its painted roses. Inside, a twist of lamp wick slept beside a sliver of tallow. Martha eased the lid and fed a breath into the dark, then laid a scrap torn from a dead account across the seam, so metal would not chatter when closed. Paper that once taught the price of breath would now muffle a hinge, its usefulness rescued from harm. She pressed the lid down until it accepted its place without protest, then rolled the tin between her hands to feel the weight come even, as a singer centers a note before letting it fly. Leather in the harness room beyond flexed and settled with a satisfied murmur. Near the threshold, a hinge she had coaxed earlier gave a small, agreeable turn, as if remembering a lesson learned without shame. She oiled a rag with a coin's worth of fat, and walked the rag's patience over a latched tongue until the metal's rasp softened into a modest courtesy. Doors, she knew, were a language, vowels in their swing, consonants in their catches. Taught properly, they could be made to speak in whispers even when they preferred declaratives. She slid the tin beneath a loose plank she had palmed in daylight, nestling it where the floorboards breathed a slow draft from the masonry. Not enough to rouse a blaze, enough to feed a thought. Above, she pinned a sliver of lint into the gap where table and brace met, for later, an unassuming pillow for an ember that would need a gentle first bed. The thimble, retrieved, rode her palm like a small moon. She tapped it once against the haft, hearing pewter's thin, content answer. A seamstress's shield, yes. Tonight, a measure, a metronome for the hand. With 2 fingers, she lifted the axe and set its head against the jamb, haft angled low, so its weight would become a shoulder when a door attempted to forget humility. The iron settled as a stone might, without drama, only truth. She pressed, then eased, reading how the wood relayed pressure into frame. The hush that followed felt like a promise kept. In that posture, the axe no longer threatened. It listened, it held, it made room. Bells from the bluff did not intrude. They paced. Their iron measured the night in phrases that found their way even through walls, each interval an empty bowl awaiting use. Between those bowls she placed her own timings. 3 breaths to cross the service hall, 1 heartbeat to lift a latch, a patient count of 5 to let a draft decide which way it will travel. She folded those counts into her body where no hand could search them. The thimble went back into her apron pocket, its rim printing a faint circle on her skin as if to remind her that circles endure where lines break. She threaded a length of cord through her fingers, cotton gone soft from many washings, and cut it clean with the knife that lived in her sleeve. The cord she coiled and tucked with the tin, not as tether, but as leash for air when air must be led rather than chased. In the quiet, the house adjusted itself. Beams sighed, joints remembered the day's heat and released it. A latch far down the corridor found its keeper and chose silence over pride. She stood in the lean-to's door and let the yard's faint cool wash her wrists. To the right lay the corridor with its watchful mouths. To the left, the gallery where garments would dream themselves into morning. The axe kept its post, a good back against a habit. The tin rested in the floor's small hollow, a bright thought hidden under plain boards. The thimble warmed her palm once more before she let it settle and be still. When she closed the lean-to, the latch took its place without a quarrel. The lantern's seam thinned to nothing, and night reclaimed its portion. She carried no blaze with her, only arrangements, a patient wick, a listening axe, a paper shamed into better service, and the steady cadence bells had pressed into her bones. Down the passage, the kitchen door awaited instruction and received it. A hinge murmured agreement, a draft found its road. Martha moved on, counting in her body and trusting in what wood, iron, and cloth can learn when asked without fear. Dusk shouldered into the house with a temperate hand, and the study received it as if shade were a guest worth seating. Mahogany kept its polish like a guarded thought. The lamp on the desk made a small island of amber where ledgers slept in their leather jackets, numbers lined like soldiers who never bled. Martha paused at the threshold long enough to take the room's pulse, a draft that crept along the baseboard and licked one corner of paper, the hearth's lax warmth idling beneath the grate, the door's habit of settling back upon itself as though eager to resume command. Here, power wore ink and spine. The seal press waited with its mouth closed, a promise to bite when called. She followed the tremor of air with her palm and marked where a near-shut door would feed breath to a small idea without rousing spectacle. The lesson was neat. Arithmetic dressed as virtue can be taught to forget its posture. The dressing room above the back gallery spoke in starch and perfume. White garments, bodices, chemisettes, a cascade of petticoats hung on padded forms like verdicts rehearsing how to stand. The ivory bellpull descended beside the wardrobe, pale as tendon, ready to move a body that need not move itself. Floorboards offered the lightest protest underfoot, a whisper in their grain that betrayed where heat rose through a seam and pooled along the wall. Martha pressed her thumb into a hinge leaf until the old metal confessed a trace of want. A breath of grease would turn its scold into courtesy. She lifted a sleeve's edge between forefinger and thumb and watched the cloth remember water, then obedience. Here, power wore whiteness and managed its own tail with pins. The lesson was unadorned. When a color is given a crown, the crown can be taken and set to honest work. Downstairs, the parlor practiced eloquence. Citrus peel lived with beeswax on the air, and the carpet taught footsteps to be soft whether or not the souls above them deserved it. The preacher's reflection earlier would have stood in the gilt mirror to test his vowels. Now only the mantel clock kept rhetoric, tapping a discreet amen with each tick. The bellpull for that? Room hung like a pale vein along wallpaper patterned with vines that pretended gentleness. She traced the cord's twist once and felt the way a tug raised air in the throat of the house, a movement that reached the kitchen as instruction, not invitation. She followed the circuit of draft from sash to grate to hall, the slow circle that comfort makes around itself. Here, power wore voice and expected to be believed. The lesson was plain. A sentence can be asked to kneel before space and time. At last, the rear gallery kept twilight like a shallow bowl. There the silver baptismal basin slept under a linen shroud, the cloth's weave catching the dim so tenderly it seemed to hush the very insects at the screens. Boards beneath carried a faint cool from the masonry, and from the far corner a thread of air crept forward as if curious where it might be needed. The axe, standing in its lean place out of sight, held its silence with an elder's patience. Martha lifted the linen's corner and let it fall again, measuring how swiftly quiet returns after small offense. She crouched and touched the seam where the gallery's floor met its brace, reading the wood's appetite for warmth. Here, power wore sacrament and assumed it could never be asked a question. The lesson was sharp. Ceremony that forgets consequence will learn it in another tongue. She walked the circuit once more, collecting tempos the way a choirmaster gathers parts. The study's measured breath, the dressing room's prim restraint, the parlor's round, persuasive hum, the gallery's poised hush. She did not rush her feet. In each room she let her hand speak to doors and hinges until they remembered courtesy. In each, she noted where a wick might learn patience, where a cloth might be invited to bear witness without spectacle, where a draft could be coaxed from sleep and set to careful work. The axe, when she returned to it, answered her palm with the modest steadiness she had come to trust, not blade tonight, but shoulder. Bells from the bluff took their next phrase and laid it along the rafters as if measuring the house for truth. Martha felt the iron settle into her ribs without hurry. She left nothing out of place, not a book's angle, nor a fold's fall, and when she passed each threshold, the latch learned to take its seat without complaint. 4 rooms, 4 altars, 4 teachings, desk and spine, sleeve and cord, mirror and tongue, basin and veil. She carried them into the passage as grammar, not threat, the way one carries a psalm, by heart, toward the hour when the world will be asked to answer what it has long refused. Night thinned the heat to a tolerable blade, and the service hall held a hush, like cloth laid over a speaking mouth. Martha stepped from the rear stoop into lamplight that wavered along flagstones, the air trading stove warmth for a cooler breath at each doorway. She set her palm on the back latch, iron worn smooth by years, and lifted until the tongue cleared the keeper with that small, obedient rise her thumb had taught it. Wood slid against wood without quarrel. A modest draught nosed past her cheek, temperate as a creature testing an outstretched hand. She paced the corridor by breath instead of number. 3 to the hearth's black mouth, 5 to the table scarred with honest work, 2 more to the pantry hinge that yesterday had scolded and now only sighed. She set forefinger to the leaf and felt the metal's tempered patience. Grease had reworded its sentence from command to courtesy. A stair took her weight 1 tread at a time, and the board she knew for a tattler gave a small complaint. She shifted left, learned the better path, and bookmarked it in muscle the way a singer keeps a key. At the dressing-room's threshold, she knelt to study the seam where floor met wall. Chalk, rubbed from a bit of limestone, ghosted a neat sign beneath the hanging gowns, no larger than a fingernail, marking the small mouth where air slid from cellar to room. She lifted the edge of a skirt with back-of-hand respect and watched fabric remember gravity, then stillness. That was not tonight's business. She let it fall and returned to the hall where the house kept its breaths in law-abiding order. In the rear gallery, dusk pooled like cool tea. She loosened a floorboard she had palmed in daylight and drew out the biscuit tin. Inside, the twist of lamp wick lay coiled and tallow-sleek, quiet as a sealed thought. The pewter thimble rested beside it, like a small bright moon. She folded a square of lint for patience, settled it under the wick, and slid the ledger scrap along the lid seam to keep metal from tattling. The tin went back into its pocket, where the boards breathed, a careful draught, not a boast, just enough to teach Ember gentleness when the hour asked. She paused at the mantel clock in the kitchen passage. Its thin tick stitched seconds into a modest seam, while from the bluff a larger iron voice braided the night into phrases. The 2 measures, house small and river wide, twined in her ear until they made 1 chord. She laid that rope of time across her shoulders where yokes sometimes ride, and found it fit. At the preacher's favored cup on the sideboard in the parlor's shadow, she crumbled a thumb of stale bread and brushed it with willow bark, nothing cruel, only enough to bend a man's throat away from wine and toward water when the sermon would prefer a smoother tongue. She wiped the rim with a clean corner and left no boast of touch behind. In passing, she tested the parlor's bell cord with a whisper of a pull and felt the house answer in the kitchen. 1 hinge you could trust now, 1 latch less proud than yesterday. Back through the corridor she walked, letting the draught choose its road while doors took their seats without complaint. The axe waited where a shoulder would be needed more than a blade. She moved it an inch and read how wood translated her intent into the jamb. Stay. Her apron pocket, the folded slip of names, warmed its place. She did not unfold it. Her fingertips traced the creases as if reading by touch alone. Ruth foremost, then those the years had asked to follow. Names did their work without noise. She honored their craft by keeping still. She stepped into the yard for 1 breath of sky and returned to the scullery where soap, smoke, and a single clean thread of resin from the lean-to made a scent like purpose. She lifted the latch once more, up, hold, down, and the door answered with the new civility she had taught it. Above, boards settled in their frames as if reconsidering pride. The clock kept its modest seam, the bluff bell waited between words. Martha stood in the narrow light and felt the night draw tight without haste, a strap cinched to exactness, ready to hold what must be carried. Night gathered itself over the wash-yard, and June's heat loosened at last, leaving the ground cool enough to remember morning. A sheet on the line bellied once and fell back, whispering a private weather. The kettles, emptied and rinsed, kept a faint tang of lye in their mouths, like a warning softened by time. Martha knelt beside the wooden trough where suds had thinned to ghost rings and pressed a folded slip of paper to her breastbone until she felt its corners learn the rhythm of her breath. She did not open it. Names know their order when the heart keeps the liturgy. The rear gallery's shadow reached across packed earth like a sober finger. Beyond it, the service hall breathed a tempered hush, a latch lifting and settling with the civility recently taught, a hinge remembering not to scold. Farther off, river damp came up the rise and salted the air with leaf and mud, a clean edge after a day that had spoken in starch. Martha listened the way a person listens for a child's stir in the next room, counting rests as carefully as notes. One cricket set the measure, another joined, and then a third, weaving a thin cadence that made time visible. She took the biscuit tin from beneath her apron and set it on the bench plank where the grain ran straight. Inside, the lamp wick lay in its coil, tallow-slick, unassuming as thread. She lifted one end and let it trail across her palm, feeling how it kept the heat of the day like a secret it intended to use well. The pewter thimble, its rim nicked by years of hymns, sat beside the wick like a small moon waiting for a tide. She touched metal to skin and then to wood, setting each back in its place as if the order of objects could tutor the night in courtesy. From the quarters lane came a voice, low, not words, merely a sound that means the child is sleeping, that the pot is off the flame, that the door has been set on the latch. Martha let those tidings settle under her collarbone, where names already sat. Ruth foremost, then Aunt Bess, then the two river hands who were not kin and were kin all the same. She tasted the paper's dust in her mouth without biting it, and the taste steadied her jaw the way a leather strap steadies a skittish mare. The axe's haft leaned against the trough, touched her knee with the patience of a staff rather than the promise of a cut. She struck flint to steel once, a small spark hovering and then declining the invitation. She did not ask again. Readiness was the lesson. Showmanship would be the lie. The thimble's hollow flashed and darkened, a brief star extinguished by choice, and the wick remembered its calm. Across the yard a shutter adjusted in its frame and stopped, as if embarrassed to have spoken. Martha exhaled so slowly that the breath did not leave. It merely changed rooms. The bell on the bluff tolled 10, round and exact, and the sound found its way through pecan leaves and down the gallery posts until it touched the crown of her head like a damp cloth. She bowed a measure, not to the bell, but to the hour, which has no mercy and no malice, and is just. 11 followed later, and between those strokes the world became more legible. The path's pale seam through trampled grass, the corridor's learned discretion, the parlor's stored warmth, loosening by degrees. She folded her fingers around the paper and felt the names answer. Not loud, not many, only sufficient. She rose from her knees and brushed grit from her skirts with a tenderness she did not waste on fabric. The axe's weight moved to her palm and settled there with the humility of a bucket accepting water. In the tin, wick and thimble knocked once like polite neighbors sharing a wall. She slid the tin into her pocket and read the yard again by touch. The trough's wet lip, the peg where rope dried its own ambition, The bench's worn edge remembering how many backs had leaned here, asking nothing of the wood but support. A door at the far end of the gallery eased and paused, then seated itself without complaint, the sound so slight it could have been a held breath remembered. Martha turned her face toward it, and then away, not to look, but to be looked at by the space she would soon cross. She thought of the dressing-room's pinned whiteness, learning to listen, of the study's spine of numbers ready to be taught another alphabet, of the parlor where water would later pretend to wash what it did not know how to name. She let the thought pass through her as one lets a draft pass through a house, usefully, without staying. When 11's echo thinned to thread, she kissed the thimble's rim, not for luck, not for blessing, but to acknowledge its service changed and honored. The names within her took their seats like kin on a bench, leaving room for one more if one appeared. She set the axe haft under her arm so the iron would not speak against stone, and she stepped into the lane that ran between scullery door and gallery stair, the night opening a narrow door for her because she had asked without raising her voice. The bell did not speak again before she reached the corridor. It did not need to. The hour was ready, the hand was steady, the house had learned to whisper. Midnight leaned its forehead against the study window, and the room made a small, obedient weather of lamplight and breath. Embered heat held low in the grate, the sort that persuades paper to loosen its starch without crying out. A fine thread of air slipped beneath the door and found the desk the way a stream finds a reed. The master bent over his ledgers with the piety of a man who trusts columns to absolve him. Pen scratched in a dry, satisfied rhythm. Paste and leather gave off a scent like hay stored too long in a sealed loft. The seal press waited by the sand shaker, mouth closed, patient as a curb on a horse. Martha entered with a coal scuttle and a few slim pieces of pine shaved to hollow, her steps paced to the room's own grammar. Threshold. 2 to the hearth. Kneel. 1 sideways to avoid the bright nick in the fender. The floor accepted her weight without complaint because she had taught it earlier to forget its favorite creak. She opened the fender as a courtesy, not to display, and set a split into the firebox so its hollow would cradle ember and not wake flame to pride. The master waved a hand without lifting his gaze from sums, a gesture that assumed the air knew which way to move. She raised the scuttle lid as if bearing a sacrament and cupped a coal with the tongs, its heart a low red like a thought refusing sleep. Laid into the pine's little valley, it breathed, dimmed, and breathed again. Resin answered in a quiet sweetness that argued patience. She drew the biscuit tin a finger's width from her apron and, with her body shadowing the act, slipped a torn strip from a dead account along the lid seam so the hinge would not chime its thin metal truth. Then the lamp wick, tallow soft, narrow as a shoelace, was eased beneath the grate's lip where the door's draught, gentled earlier by a near-shut, could school it to a measured appetite. At the door she set the brass stop, not as wedge, but as tutor, keeping the jam almost, the way a careful mouth is neither shut against prayer nor open to boasting. Air learned the lesson at once, a sip instead of a swallow, a hum rather than a gust. The wick took ember's language in that new grammar, not a flare but a bloom, and the study's breath grew articulate without spectacle. Corners of one ledger's leaves curled a hair toward the room as if listening. The master coughed a civil cough, the kind a gentleman offers to remind poor lungs that work is being done. She straightened the topmost ledger with 2 fingers and felt the paper's tooth, a faint roughness where hands had fed on it for years. At the margin, a thin tide mark showed where a damp thumb once paused, now darkening as warmth coaxed memory forward. Names that had been translated into weight and profit re-entered the air as an odor. Paste turned to sugar, sugar turned to faint scorch, a theology of paper reconsidering its creed. The pen faltered. A blot opened like an eclipse over tidy figures, and he reached for sand with a little frown, scattering grains that stitched themselves into the wet and did not erase it. Martha lowered the scuttle lid without letting it speak, and arranged a second pine shaving, not above but adjacent, so it would shield Ember's modest lesson and not call attention to itself. The wick's glow walked along its twist with the slow courtesy of a guest who knows the house better than the host supposes. She brushed the hearth brick with her sleeve, catching an ash mote before it could betray the truth of heat. Across the room, the lamp's chimney fogged and cleared, as though the glass had taken up the habit of breathing. The doors almost closed governed the room's lungs. Paper warm at the edges loosened its spine first, then its geometry. Columns slouched in dignified exhaustion. A ribbon marker, taught for years, slackened and bowed its head. In the window's faint mirror, the master looked like a man watching fog take the road he had claimed in daylight. He leaned nearer to his figures, as if proximity could stiffen their resolve. The seal press gleamed and said nothing. Leather on the desk gave off that sweet, tired smell of privilege, grown drowsy. She let her hand rest lightly against the door and felt the thread of air choose her fingers, pass between them, and travel toward the grate, a pilgrim content to walk. It ticked the wick and moved on. The ledger's corners answered with a softened consonant, curl, not crack. He dabbed again with sand, found no obedience in the blot, and at last lifted his head, eyelids narrowed against a thin haze that was not smoke enough to alarm, only idea enough to unsettle. "Mind the fire," he said, which meant, "Keep me comfortable, keep me right." Martha inclined as if to stoke, and instead turned the hollowed split a finger, making a small alley where Ember could speak to Wick uninterrupted. The room accepted her edit. Warmth deepened under the desk where air pooled. Above, the tiniest current lifted a corner of paper and put it down again, the way a mother corrects a child's posture with 2 fingers. She reached for the doorstop and pinched it a breath narrower, a new syllabus for the room's respiration. The wick obeyed its teacher. No blaze, no theater, only revision. Outside, midnight's iron spoke from the bluff, one clean stroke that entered through shutter slat and lodged in the chair's carved ear. The tone walked the molding, stepped down the fireplace brick, and settled against the ledger's spine with the solemnity of a verdict neither spoken nor stayed. The master coughed, now impatient. He folded one book and slid it aside, then reached for another whose leather had been groomed to believe in immortality. His thumb found the warmed corner and paused, puzzled to feel life where he had installed order. Martha lifted the scuttle, its lid agreeing to silence, and turned to the threshold. The doors near shut parted an inch for her and then resumed its discipline as she passed. In the hall, cooler air remembered its road along plaster and stair. Hinges, earlier persuaded, kept to whispers. She did not look back. Behind her, numbers continued their conversion, ink to scent, stiffness to curve, certainty to ash that would not fly so much as subside. The seal would not bite tonight. The pen scratch would not harden into law. She walked the corridor with the scuttle's dark mouth closed, carrying no flame, only the arrangement of breath and patient heat she had set in motion. In her apron the thimble learned again to be a weight rather than an ornament. The axe, standing where a shoulder would soon be needed, held its silence like a vow. From the bluff the bell withheld its next phrase, and the hush that followed felt less like absence than like consent. She stepped into that consent and let the house tell itself a different story under its own roof, a story that began with a wick and a draft and a ledger remembering how to forget. Near midnight, the back corridor held a sift of flour that made footprints into pale script, and the air along the baseboard moved with a quiet resolve taught earlier to mind its manners. A lantern, trimmed low, cupped its light so tightly that walls seemed to lean in, and the stair above gave a single, patient murmur, as if warning its own treads to speak only when spoken to. The mistress, narrow at the mouth and ribboned keys at her waist, planted herself before the stoop door like a lectern set to block a passage. A young maid, apron white as a new page, kept her basket close, her gaze fixed on the latch as if eyes might lift iron by politeness alone. Martha entered by the scullery turn, where stove-warm air yielded to a cooler seam. She let the corridor's breath rid her first, a taut hinge now fluent in restraint, a latch remembering to rise without rattle, the small draught from the gallery consenting to a steady road. The axe had been given a new vocation. She slid its head into place at the base of the back kitchen door, half-angled like a shoulder that will not be moved. No flash of blade, no boast, only weight turned into grammar. The panel, tempted to shut, discovered an elder against its will and accepted instruction. "Back you go," the mistress said, voice wrapped in lace. The keys chimed at her hip, a private hymn to habit. She touched the ribbon with 2 fingers, as if caress could make metal into law. Martha set 2 fingertips beneath the latch and lifted with the exact rise she had trained into it. A modest, silent clearance, the tongue leaving its keeper as a well-taught child leaves a room without dragging its feet. Between thumb and plate she slid a sliver of folded linen, nothing more than a laundry edge retired to dignify iron. The cloth learned a new office at once, muffler, not napkin. The door gave without a cluck. Draught stepped through, touched the lantern's flame to a lower bough, and went on, leading the way rather than fleeing. The girl did not need telling. She moved in the space the door made, her sleeves white, no longer a tag for ownership, but a wing-shaped courtesy to motion. Basket tilted and passed like a small boat finding the current. The mistress reached, a curb of fingers late to their work, and found only air where certainty had been. Keys struck jam, then fell back against bone with an undignified knock that learned humility in a single lesson. "Mind yourself," the mistress breathed, but her sentence thinned in the corridor's new grammar. The stair above offered a low ascent as if the house itself had marked the correction. Martha stooped once, not for apology, but to retrieve what the moment asked of her. The ribbon of keys, turned awkward by their boast, had snagged on a nail's pebbled head. She did not return them. She left them settled where wood held them gently, a circle of metal resting against a board that had chosen, for once, to keep. The lantern showed flower lilt on shoe tips and a smear where a heel had slid earlier, a treacherous gloss from kitchen grease that remembered its long service to appetite. Martha leaned the haft a breath deeper and felt the jam accept the extra meaning, a conversation between wood and wood that did not require witnesses. Doors had served tyranny and shelter both. Tonight they learned ceremony. Who goes and who goes free, who stands aside and calls it order. From the bluff, iron chose a single stroke and sent it through sash and stairwell. The tone touched plaster and settled in ribs without insisting on a name. In its wake the house held still, as though the clock had pinched its own tongue. The mistress drew her hand back to her bodice and found the bell cord absent from reach, useless anyway when a hinge refuses to cry. She gathered the remains of poise like a shawl lifted from a chair and discovered it narrower than she'd remembered. Martha let the linen sliver fall back into her palm and folded it once more for later service. She did not meet the mistress's eye. She addressed the door with her touch, thanking it for its learning. The latch lowered into its keeper without show, and air continued to walk the corridor as if the house had been built to please it. The girl had gone to ground, safe in the pantry's dusk or out under the yard's honest sky. Her apron's white, already remeaning itself to plain usefulness instead of claim. "Who taught you—" the mistress began, then dismissed her own question with a half-gesture that looked like a moth giving up a pain. She would find some other corridor tomorrow where keys thought themselves sovereign. Tonight the hinge had chosen courtesy over spectacle, and that choice had made a road where walls had been. Martha eased the axe head away, an inch only, and the panel kept its improved temper. She left the keys where wood held them, a paused clatter gentle to rest, and turned toward the central hall where steps bend the breath of men who like to be heard. Behind her the door remained a door, and not a mouth, the latch a servant again, and not a petty king. The flower on the floor took a last note of feet, and then lay quiet, as if a page had been turned without tearing. Ahead, the stair waited with Scripture on its lips, and a single shallow ridge to trouble it into listening. The central stair rose from the foyer like a patient river of wood under whale-oil light, and the hall clock kept its private catechism behind glass, a delicate tick that would not be hurried. Sunday's preacher mounted with a chalice lift of his hand, verse rolling from him in smooth lengths about order and obedience, about the blessing of knowing one's rung. Warmth drifted up from the dining room in ribbons touched with spice and meat. From the upper rooms a cooler draught answered, and where the two airs met, they made a tempered weather that asked a man to mind his step. Martha waited one turn below the landing, her shoulder in shadow, her thumb resting on the banister just above the shallow ridge where polish had thinned, an ordinary scar that only a housekeeper would have catalogued. The boards remembered her feet. She had rehearsed their temper the way one learns a hymn in parts. Below, doors she had tutored now took their seats without complaint. Above, a single hinge mused to itself and fell silent. The axe, left to its keeping where weight would be wisdom, did not accompany her. Tonight the lesson belonged to angle and breadth. "Consider the ordinance," he intoned, savoring the shape of the word more than its work. He raised his heel for the next lift, still tasting his own syllables. She read the tread before his foot arrived the way a miller reads grain, by habit and finger, and felt the notch her chalk had remembered in thought, if not in sign. It was not a trap. It was a difference, modest as truth. His shoe found it, and doctrine came into contact with carpentry. There was no spectacle. The glass did not shatter, the rail did not groan. Only a small betrayal of balance moved through his body like a confession he had not meant to speak. His free hand clutched for the banister and met the banister's honest curve. Wine tipped within the glass and drew a dark ribbon down the outside like a verse corrected by margin. He swallowed a word and could not retrieve it. Breath replaced Scripture because breath must. Martha stepped half a pace, not to catch him. He was not falling to ruin, only to pause, but to stand where harm would not find anyone else. The clock, behind its pane, tapped a single, deliberate tick, as if to bless the edit. Air raised the hair at the nape of her neck with a cool finger, and then withdrew. The stare held him as stare is sworn to do, but it required of him a new humility. Weight considered, height relinquished, phrase surrendered to space. He looked downward across his shoulder with an eye-iced smile being born and failing. "A trick of the wood," he said, trying to domesticate surprise. "Nothing at all." His voice sounded thinner, like a ribbon drawn sharp between two pins, and the hall answered not with sympathy, but with accuracy. Rhetoric, deprived of altitude, must make its way on foot. Martha let her knuckles drift along the rail as if feeling for a splinter, and the smoothness told her the house had no desire to wound tonight. In her mind she saw the dressing-room's white cohorts standing in their pale pride, and the study where Sums had begun to breathe an unfamiliar air. She did not visit those thoughts. She allowed them to pass through, companions rather than errands. The preacher tested the next tread with a caution he would not own, heel first, then toe, and his glass steadied. From the bluff, iron offered a single chime that threaded the stairwell without touching anything it did not intend. The note entered the preacher's chest and pressed there a moment. His next line emerged plainer, shaved of its ornament as a field trimmed after harvest. He glanced at the clock as though sight could bend time back, but the clock declined to perform, continuing its measured kindness. Not louder, only sure. He resumed the climb, slower, and favored the rail now as a man favors the advice he once scorned. Martha held the landing's underside with her gaze, reading the narrow drafts that move there the way small winds have counsels where men think only of speeches. The stair, its grain patient, its rise exact, kept its oath to lift without ceremony and to discipline without cruelty. Scripture, having been asked to share the floor with geometry, obeyed. When he reached the turn, he paused as if to reclaim altitude sermon, and found instead the modest dignity of arrival. "Carry that tray with care," he said to no one, and the instruction returned to him sounding like a prayer he had not intended. Martha neither nodded nor bowed. She stepped aside and let him pass into the upper passage where doors, well-mannered now, received him without flourish. Behind her, the banister took back its quiet shine. Below, the foyer's air gathered itself into a shallow pool that would soon flow toward the parlor, where linen slept over silver. Above, rooms waited with their own orderly breath. The hall clock kept picking seconds into a thin seam, and the bell outside withheld its next word like a teacher saving the last line. Martha descended one tread, then another, toward the place where feast masks and water vows would be asked to meet consequence, leaving on the wood nothing but the small correction of a foot that knows where it belongs. The parlor kept a Sabbath brightness as if light itself had been pressed and starched. Whale oil flames steadied in their chimneys, and the long cloth, white as claimed innocence, ran from end to end with scarcely a ripple. Silver ranked itself in ordered gleam. Crystal stood like small bells, without tongues, and at the far wall the baptismal basin, veiled under linen, waited for Sunday hands. The air bore citrus and a trace of beeswax, the tidy perfume of rooms that prefer ceremony to truth. In this precise climate, the ivory bellpull hung beside the mantel like a pale tendon, ready to twitch the house to heal. Martha moved at the table's lee, a servant's current invisible against the furniture's shoreline. Raw wood lived under the formal skin. Beneath the polished edge, the plank remembered sap and wind. She crouched by the knee-hole where chair legs nested and thumbed the seam where brace met belly, feeling the faint cool that rose through the floor from masonry. From the service door, left on its careful gap, a private breath crossed her knuckles, neither bold nor bashful, merely consistent. She marked the draft as one marks a friend's step on gravel. It would arrive when called, no more. The mistress presided near the head, lace tempering her throat, a hand on the linen veil that hid the silver bowl. Guests gathered in low company along the walls, voices held like saucers, not to spill. On a side table waited the preacher's cup, polite water for now, its rim clean as a promise. The mantel clock tied seconds into knots and untied them again, refusing to alter pace for any appetite. Martha touched the underside of the table with a cloth that left a whisper of oil. Nothing a guest would smell. Everything a wick would read. From her apron she brought the small coil of lamp wick, tallow-paled, narrow as a shoestring, and pinned it just under the drop of the table's edge, where the cloth would drape close. The pin bit wood with a shy pop. The wick lay obedient, humble as thread. She set beneath it a square of lint, folded thin, the patient bed, and smoothed it once with the back of her nail. A modest thing, this tether, asking only a breath. At the service door, she adjusted the gap no wider than a coin's thickness, tutoring the room's lungs toward restraint rather than hunger. Conversation assembled itself around expectations, blessings invoked without cost, names spoken for favor rather than memory. The mistress lifted the linen's corner from the basin and let it fall in a gesture meant to promise abundance. The cloth made no sound. Martha, at the sideboard, tipped a decanter to polish its surety, and in that same motion brushed a fingertip along the table's underlip where the wick waited. Her touch was not ignition, It was confirmation, a finger across a brow before labor's hour. Air found the place she had cultivated. Heat lived under the table like a tenant too modest to be seen, fed by the grate's tired breath and the door's measured gift. The wick learned the lesson without announcing itself. No blaze, no spectacle, only a warmth that colored the linen's inner country a shade deeper than shadow. Starch reconsidered its pride. The cloth, immaculate by decree, discovered it could be written upon by consequence. Martha kept to her work, decanting nothing, polishing nothing, a woman arranging reflections. At the mistress's cue, an arm reached toward the bell-pull, one tug to summon, two to correct, and halted, puzzled by a scent as polite as warm paste. A guest lifted a spoon and set it down without tasting. The preacher smoothed his coat with fingers that wanted the stare's authority returned to them. No one named smoke. There was none. Only a memory of heat made into suggestion, a sentence begun under the table in the grammar of curl and hush. The mantel clock stepped on. Martha slipped past the preacher's elbow and trimmed a lamp by the mantel to satisfy ceremony's eye. The flame lifted and then settled, and a soft eddy moved along the wall toward the head of the table where the cloth's hem kissed the paneling. The underworld brightened a fraction. Linen took a mark the size of a far coin, a small island in a pale sea, and the island spread to a shoal, then stilled, learning coastline the way a child learns letters. The basin's shroud quivered, a breeze misread by those who do not watch for such things, and the silver beneath remembered water without touching it. When the bluff bell gave its first iron note for midnight, the sound threaded the room without asking leave. With the second, the warmth under the table answered by a degree. With the third, shadow changed its posture under plates near the middle. By the fourth, the far end understood the message in outline, if not in text. A murmur replaced talk. The mistress's hand rose with command and found her instruments unready. The bell-pull too thin to silence heat, the key ring not in reach, the room unwilling to rearrange itself on cue. Martha laid a folded napkin on the sideboard and pressed its crease with her thumb, the gesture ordinary as dusting. Under the table, curl became character. The linen's underside wrote itself, letter by letter, an alphabet no ledger had yet accounted for. Not harm, warning, not riot, reversal. The white that had supervised appetite took on a vocation beside it. Witness, not mask. The preacher's mouth opened for blessing and closed again, the stare still in his ankle, the hour in his ear. A guest shifted a chair, the leg ticking wood with a small apology. She stepped to the service door and eased it half the width of a breath, feeling the draught sweeten, not swell. The room accepted the sentence's next clause. At the head, the mistress lifted the veil from the basin at last as if to baptize air, and air answered by warming her knuckles from beneath. She snatched back the linen and then, realizing herself, placed it aside as if that had been intended. "A window," someone said, though windows were shut to keep superiority in and weather out. The clock refused sympathy. It kept the measure indifferent as water. Martha met the cloth's edge with 2 fingers, testing for heat that would need rebuke, and found discipline instead. The wick's obedience, the draught's modesty, the wood's content. She attended to the lamp again, to the placement of spoons, the angle of a fork that had misremembered its rank. Across the room, a woman dabbed her upper lip with a handkerchief, its white square promising privacy to a face that had found its own reflection less certain than before. The basin, unveiled, held only its dull moon of light, no water yet somehow already wet with the story it would later pretend to tell. When the bell finished speaking, 12 laid down like stones on a path. The room did not return to its former tale. It could not. Linen bore a shy testimony that eyes could ignore only by effort, and the air moved with a purpose separate from command. Martha took up the decanter and turned toward the door, whose gap had governed this liturgy of warmth. She left the cloth to its new office, and the guests to their altered comfort, and she passed into the corridor where hinges, chastened, made way. Behind her, authority sat where it always sat, and discovered, without bruise or bruise given, that consequence had taken the chair beside it and would not be dismissed. Pre-dawn would come later, for now the yard held a middle hour, neither loud nor meek, with the pecan leaves barely moving and the earth giving back a little cool like a saved coin. Martha crossed from the galleries dim to the well square of honesty, where the rope hung quiet over the stone curb. The air bore 3 simple traces: smoke thinned to a memory, soap gone from rebuke to clean, and a resin note that wandered out from the lean-to as if to be counted among friends. Behind her, doors that once announced themselves now behaved like modest guests, hinges easing, latches agreeing, timber at rest. She set the coal scuttle on the bench and placed the biscuit tin upon the well wall, its rubbed bare lid reflecting a poor moon made from lantern shine and patience. The pewter thimble lay inside like a small bell with its tongue removed. The twist of wick, obedient and pale, kept the shape her fingers had taught. Martha dipped the bucket, heard rope hum against wood, and brought up water that tasted of stone and night, cold enough to steady a hand. When she tipped the cup, the pour walked over brass in a thin, continuous sheet. The hiss that answered was not drama, only completion, a long breath released after work, well held to measure. The tin cooled under her palm until metal lost the memory of heat. She closed the lid without a click. The scrap of dead account she had set along the seam earlier kept its last useful office and then became only paper again. The thimble she lifted next, feeling the faint rim print it had left in her skin throughout the hours at the table and stair. A seamstress's shield, yes, tonight, a gauge for restraint, how much to do, how much to refrain, where a line ends and a circle begins. She set it on the curb and let dew take it for a moment, so pewter learned ordinary. Weather again, and not the fever of vows. Nearby the axe leaned where tools retire, half touching whitewash as a staff at the end of a march touches ground. She took it by the throat, read its balance with the briefest sway, and gave it back to the rack among hoes and forks, handle touching handle, in that humble fellowship implements keep when men are asleep. The blade had not bitten flesh. Its office had been a shoulder, and the iron looked easier for it, as if violence declined could shine as well as violence spent. In the kitchen yard a cock tested his courage once and thought better of it. The bluff bell between obligations held its tongue and let the pause carry meaning. Names stirred in her like coals spared from ash. She did not fan them. She let them glow as kin do on a porch when talk is finished, and nearness says the rest. Ruth's syllables settled first to a steady ember, then those who had stood with her in small ways, no ledger would honor. Old Charity with the mint leaves, the twins who kept watch over a fevered child, the rivermen whose laughter had once made poor soup taste better. She did not look toward the house. Plaster and pride would be sorting themselves without her rehearsal. She had given them new grammar, enough lesson for one night. She crouched at the scullery step and let a second cup of water fall onto packed earth, a contained spill that darkened into a perfect round. It soaked inward with the patience of a debt repaid, leaving a ring at the edge like a seal pressed on wax to close a matter. With the blunt of a forefinger, she traced that damp circumference and felt the truth of it. Not triumph, not disaster. Balance. The ledgers that breathed paste and leather in the study would never write this figure. She inscribed it where it cannot be erased, in soil and in the small exact habits of doors and hands. A latch within the passage found its keeper and seated itself gently, as if to say Amen without the word. Martha set the cooled tin among the yard's honest reliquary, a bucket with one new stave, a peg box of bent nails saved for second lives, a cracked jar that still could hold seed. She placed the thimble atop the tin and let their shadows marry on the stone. The axe inside gave no opinion. The air tasted clean enough to trust. She straightened, wiped her palms on her apron in 2 firm passes, and stood still until stillness belonged to her again. Bells would speak later. For now silence held the better truth, and she allowed it to pour over her like plain water, sufficient and just. Dawn bleached the road to a pale grit, and Natchez rubbed its eyes with the backs of wagon wheels, while porch railings took the first light as if it were verdict enough. Hooves came quick along the sandy lane, tack clicking a fussy rhythm, and the rear steps of the big house received men whose mouths wore law like a borrowed collar. Martha stood where the stoop boards keep the nights cool, wrists crossed without. Theater, the air around her trimmed of smoke and made plain by early birdsong. The axe had gone to its rest. The biscuit tin lay among honest things. Nothing at her belt but breath. They looped cords soft as command, and not one strand kinder for it. She did not lean away. She let her weight be the exact truth of her body, and no more. As they turned her toward the lane, doors along the passage conducted themselves with the discretion they had learned. A latch ceded, a hinge deferred noise, a threshold remembered grace even for boots that did not offer it. The yard smelled of wet dust where she had poured balance. That round of earth had dried to a darker coin and kept its witness without asking to be named. The quarters opened a careful inch despite themselves. Faces filled the space between jam and air. Old Charity's scarf, neat as Sunday, a boy with one hand flattening his own cheek as if to hold his breath, still, twins side by side with shadows under both sets of eyes. A square of white lifted and fell in a cabin window, laundry moved by nothing but the river's small rumor, a refusal to become a tag again. No one called. Names traveled without sound from rib to rib, an offering passed along like a bowl of what little is left when everyone has eaten, and one more arrives. Town received her with the indifferent kindness of ruts that remember every cart. A shop door rang its bell, the note bright and short. Shutters came unpinned. A lad with bread swung his basket as if to teach it cheer. Heat had not gathered yet, and the courthouse steps were still cool to the palm. Columns lifted a pale pretense, their shadows long enough to call themselves mercy. Inside, the hall kept the musk of ink and old wool. Pine benches creaked under bodies, arranged as if this were church with rumor for sermon. On the table lay contracts wrinkled and darkened at the corners, paper that had learned weather it had not expected. Their edges curled like ears, trying too hard to hear. The preacher sat 3 benches back, ankle quiet for once, pride bandaged into good behavior. The mistress wore a composure fitted at the seams and could not hide where it tugged. A clerk let his pen skate, hesitated over a blot, and frowned as if the ink had learned to differ with him. A clock somewhere, smaller than the bell at the bluff, offered its quick domestic tick, and the room borrowed confidence from the sound. Questions came like smooth stones rolled in a palm. Martha answered those that would not turn to lie in the mouth. The rest she let pass her shoulders and fall behind, leaving no dent in the dust. She did not raise her chin, she did not drop it. Silence did what it was asked to do. Kept shape, held value, said only what was true about air and time. Someone called her insolent with a voice that trembled toward admiration and fled back to anger. Someone else said grief and made the words small to keep their own portion safe. Outside, iron from the bluff delivered noon, in chamanta strokes that walked in through the sash like weather. One found the judge's ribs, and his hand settled on the arm of his chair. Another tapped the clerk's pen and made it still. Another located the preacher's throat and rested there, and he swallowed without speech. Martha felt the sound touch the sternum where names keep order. The hour sat down and crossed its legs, and did not apologize for staying. The hall decided to breathe again when the 12th finished. People began to be people with faces and heat. When they led her back across the portico, the steps spoke coolly through her soles, stone telling bone what it tells everyone, weight counted, balance remembered, no blessing added. Sun had climbed to the shoulder of the building and made the white cloths inside the gallery wane to the color of old milk. Outside, light was honest and would not flatter. The boy from the lane stood at the curb, his eyes making a record no ledger would see. She met that gaze for the space between the little clock's ticks and gave it back, not as comfort, not as mandate, simply so it would not be alone. The cord rasped once as she moved. The rasp was a fact. A breeze hustled a handful of courthouse dust down the steps and into the street where cart tracks braided and unbraided the day. Behind her in the hall, paper waited to try again to mean more than it had earned. Ahead, the bell's echo had already left the air and taken up lodging in memory where it cannot be bound. She went forward, not bowed and not unbowed, into the light that insists on itself, while benches, mouths, and ledgers recalculated according to what consequence had taught them under a roof the night before. Late light slanted through the barred slit like a narrow blade dulled by dust, and the holding room kept a tempered cool that belonged to limewash and stone. The bench under Martha carried the memory of other backs without complaint. It offered steadiness rather than comfort, grain smoothed by waiting. Outside, the road muttered in brief phrases, wheel, hoof, a boy's shout cut short, while inside the air held its breath the way a church holds silence after a hymn. Iron at the window did its plain work, neither boastful nor cruel, only fact. She rested her hands on her knees, skin marked faintly where cord had taught redness, and then released it. The quiet shaped itself into small, legible sounds, a key turning just enough, a shoe pausing at a seam in the floor, a door choosing to close without remark. She let each speak in its own register, and gave none dominion. Names arranged themselves behind her ribs as evening congregants, Ruth taking the front place, then those who had kept watch in kitchens and fields, then the few whose goodness had come at a cost they paid willingly. None jostled, all present. She did not summon them. Presence, like breath, is better unforced. White rose in her thinking, not the parade white that trafficked in price, but cloth strung between. Cabin posts in the lane once Sunday was done. She saw shirts shouldering wind like modest sails, a child shift making a small, fearless flag, aprons lifting and settling as if they had found a tide kinder than commerce. That same color, once tied to Ruth's wrist to make her less than her name, here widened itself and asked for no witness but air. Memory remade an old sign into use. Cover, not claim. Shelter, not leash. The thimble in her mind's pocket cooled to its rightful work. How much flour will keep tomorrow honest? How small a stitch mends without calling attention to the mend? The axe, in recollection, leaned where tools rest shoulder to shoulder. It had not been a wound today, but a brace, the moral weight a frail door borrows when met by a will to, practiced at taking. Ledgers, those tidy spines, no longer argued in her ear. Their ink had learned humility and heat, and would learn ash without spectacle. Bells, for the moment, kept counsel. When they spoke again, it would be to mark time, not to order souls. She turned her face toward the window and accepted the narrow view. A slice of road, a corner of sky, one leaf from the courthouse elm, scraping itself green against the edge of light. It was enough. Where the sun met iron, a brief brightness made a ladder rung no foot could use. The light withdrew without complaint, leaving a soft reckoning on the wall, the color of skimmed milk. In that paler square she could almost believe the day had washed itself and learned a quieter dialect. A lock made its modest click in the corridor and moved on, as if not to intrude. She did not stiffen. Doors had been tyrants. They had also become students. Taught with grease and patience, they had learned a gentler grammar, when to receive, when to yield, how to be present without announcing. She leaned forward and let her shoulders make their own porch. Even a body can be a threshold, inviting weather to pass without taking anything it does not offer. The road outside blushed toward evening. Somewhere a woman shook a sheet and clapped at once to urge the last damp away. Martha closed her eyes and watched that motion without pain, white lifting, white consenting to wind, white turning from emblem into bread and bed. Bells would call the hour soon enough. Verdicts, too, would put on their clothes and try to look like justice. She sat plain on the bench and let the room be a room, and not a sentence. When she opened her eyes, the wall had given back its light to the air, and the iron had gone to shadow, both doing their duty with decency. She folded her hands as if holding a bowl she would later fill, and the silence around her settled like linen on a line, clean and without charge. Late light pooled along the levee like warm brass, and the river moved with its slow, sovereign will, carrying June and January alike, without asking which mattered more. Porches made small theaters of shade, tin cups sweated on rails, a child's skipping song braided, itself with the creak of a rope swing and the rasp of cicadas finding their pitch. Stories do not wait for quiet, they make it. So when the first voice began, the yard gentled itself, and the beans on their string lattices climbed as if leaning in to hear. They spoke Martha's name as cadence rather than trumpet, not miracle, measure. An axe remembered not as bite, but as brace. Ledgers recalled only as dust, and the faint sweetness of paste turned honest by heat. White, no longer a tag tied to a wrist, but a length of cloth, shouldering sunlight on a line between cabins, its lift permission rather than claim. Bells, once bossy, were said to have learned patience. Now they kept time for planting and wakes, for first steps and last words, not for mastery. Doors, contrite and wiser, were praised when they took their seats softly, latches choosing courtesy over clatter. Names passed mouth to mouth like a cup at a long table. Ruth leading, but not alone, and each syllable, well handled, grew into shade where a body might rest. The telling traveled from stoop to stoop, from washing yard to churchyard gate. New rooms learned old grammar. A school kept in a borrowed shed chalked letters on a slate so surely that the board seemed to brighten with each stroke. A girl wrote her father's name twice, not to correct it, but to thicken its truth. And when she said it aloud, her voice made a small bell that answered itself. A boy stood under a door eased from pride to welcome, and announced that hinges have two duties, to hold and to yield. He swung it once and let it settle, pleased by the modest amen it made. Fields took up the story too. At noon a wind came through corn like a choir deciding on a key. Men cutting cane paused and listened to their own silence and found it full. At river's edge someone set the baptismal basin, rescued from its throne of lace, to catch rainwater for thirsty plants. The silver dulled to a useful moon, and the rain sang its own service into the metal without sermon. On Saturdays, quilts pieced from cast-offs, including stubborn squares of white that had once done other meaner work, were lifted to air. Those pale scraps sewn into sky and path warmed actual sleep and dreamed no harm. When sorrow needed seat, the tale made room. It did not pretend that verdicts had learned justice overnight. It did not forget that doors can turn tyrant again if starved of oil and witness. But it set before every ear the clean inversion, a tool repurposed, a ledger quieted, a cloth redeemed, a bell reclaimed, a name kept whole, and a hinge taught to whisper. In the courthouse shadow at noon, men took off their hats without bowing and let the sun count them as men. On Sunday, voices in the back benches reached for harmony that didn't flatter a single throat. Children learned to hear the houses talk. the terms by which locks promise safety rather than silence, the way a latch's hush can be a blessing when used for mercy. Summer moved to autumn. Beans gave way to collards. The river lifted and fell according to its own scripture. The story did not settle into a single set of events. It refused tidiness. In one porch version, the hour turned when paper remembered it was only plant and paste. In another, a door learned humility and made a road where rule had stood. In a third, a stair required a preacher to converse with geometry before he spoke to souls. Discrepancy didn't bruise truth, it breathed for it, the way a chest rises and falls. The tale kept its oath to serve consequence rather than comfort, to honor the living without flattering the dead. On an evening rinsed clean by a brief rain, the ring gathered again. A woman smoothed her apron and named names, placing each like a plate in front of a guest. A man with sawdust in his cuffs said that in his shop the white wood is planned to board and never to whip, and folks nodded. A child, half asleep on a lap, dreamed a bell that did not command, but marked a path home, one low note to the next, until the door accepted small, careful hands and opened. The river, hearing none of it, did its work, the city, pretending not to hear, altered by inches. When darkness came up gentle and the story's edges softened, the voice that had begun yielded to another, and then to rest. The yard rediscovered its own noises. Kettle lid pinging cool, a hinge consenting to night, a name breathed once into the seam of a prayer and left there to keep. And as the circle rose slow to preserve what had been made between them, let those who have found a home for this account within their keeping return, and keep the watch with us. Lend a mark of favor, as one leaves a token on the meeting bench, and set a thought or question in the common ledger, so another voice may answer and the next name find its way. If this story stayed with you, come back to keep watch with us. Leave a small sign of support, and share your thoughts or questions so the circle can grow.